Hello, I'm David Salter. I'm an attorney practicing in Roseville, Minnesota. I'm an estate planning attorney. At Salter Law LLC, our mission is simple. We prepare you for the journey ahead by providing personalized, comprehensive estate planning guidance to ensure a safe and smooth passage of your assets onto your loved ones when you pass away. I have three areas of practice. They are estate planning, long-term care pre-planning, and estate administration when someone passes away. These areas protect you and your loved ones and your assets at every stage of life, whether you're just starting out, establishing a career, growing your family, heading into retirement, experiencing health issues, and then I help families after someone passes away. I work with my wife, Julie Salter, and she is my director of client services and marketing.
Thanks, David. So yes, as part of our mission, we want to guide you past those obstacles so that you have a smooth life journey. To help with that, we are partnering with local experts who can provide further expertise on how to guide you through those life transition points. Today, we are pleased to introduce Dan and Nancy Loeffler. They are founders and grief counselors of their company, Being with Grief, located here in St. Paul, Minnesota. Their passion is really changing the conversation around grief and helping clients find meaning, purpose, and joy in their life again so that they can fully participate in their lives. This is first of a three-part series that we are partnering with them. And their first seminar here is going to explain the many ways that grief shows up in our lives and help us understand how to recognize it. So with that, thank you, Dan and Nancy. We're pleased to have you today.
Thank you very much, David and Julie, for grief. It was more the opposite way around. Grief found us. Almost 23 years ago, our then 17-year-old daughter, Leah, died from injuries she sustained in a car accident on her way to school. And that sent us on a path that we didn't want to go on. It sent us on a path of pain and destruction. It felt like destruction of our lives. And we each had to go on our own journey before we were able to come back together and be able to help others to navigate their own grief journeys and to do it in a way that honors Leah and honors our own grief journeys.
Exactly. Death of a loved one is obviously one of the big picture grief that we encounter in our lives. But there are also many other aspects of grief that we all deal with. When we experience the loss of a job or the loss of a friendship, maybe you've gone through a divorce. All of these things are forms of grief that you may not realize, although those are some of the bigger ones.
Those are some of the bigger ones. before we go on any further, let's define grief. What is grief?
Well, grief is the normal and natural process that we go through. And to recognize that it is a normal response to loss is the first step in understanding what grief is.
Exactly. I used to think that the only time we experienced grief was when a loved one died. That's why that's up at the top by itself. But as Dan mentioned, there are other ways that grief shows up along our life's path. In addition to the ones he mentioned, when we experience the loss of our health or a change in our health, we experience grief because our life changes. And when our life changes, we have to adapt and figure out what's next. When we have an issue with our child's health, there's also grief then, or if our child has learning challenges.
Exactly. And grief also can occur in small and everyday occurrences. Take, for example, the loss of a pet. Many people who are pet owners and have experienced the loss of a pet are devastated by that. We'll talk more about that as we
Well, I
go
also
through.
think this is a good time to mention that even though we're listing many different types of grief, there's no comparison. We advise our clients not to compare losses because each loss stands on its own and brings its own set of difficult feelings. And so these are not listed in any hierarchy of any grief hierarchy, if there was such
Yes.
a thing. So these are just some of the over 40 instances of grief that Dan mentioned at the beginning.
And that's not even to consider some of the overwhelming grief that we are exposed to in our daily lives, what we call the sorrows of the world, things like poverty, homelessness, the natural disasters that we have read about and heard from other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And of course, there is the grief that occurred when COVID pandemic was upon us.
Exactly. And I don't think we even have fully recognized the impact that COVID has had on our lives and the lives of our family and friends.
Too true.
So speaking of unrecognized grief, what is it? And if it's unrecognized, how can we do something about it? Well, unrecognized grief, we've seen shows up in the masks we wear or the disguises. It shows up in disguises of anger or isolation or compartmentalization or feeling stuck and not knowing how to move past being stuck. But grief can also show up when you lose a dream or whenever your life turns out differently than you thought it would or that you wanted it to. And doesn't that talk about just about everything? So let's take a look at small griefs versus larger griefs. And you might be asking me, what's a small grief and what's a larger grief? And didn't you just say not to compare griefs? Yes, I still say we don't compare griefs. However, we describe small griefs as things that happen on a daily basis that are relatively insignificant, like being late for a meeting. It may not be insignificant for your job, and it brings up some of those same feelings of angst, at least for me it does. Sitting in traffic, having a minor disagreement with a coworker or a family member. If we learn how to meet those, the feelings that arise when we're in those situations, it can help prepare us for the bigger griefs.
It can even be something as simple as, where did I put my car keys?
Yes.
Those small things can accumulate over
Because
time.
it's a loss. Remember, grief is the normal reaction to any loss. If you lose your car keys, there's grief.
And looking at it in this way, we can prepare ourselves when the bigger griefs occur. It won't make a bigger grief any easier to deal with, but at least then we have the tools in our tool belt to be
Right.
able to approach the bigger grief when it occurs.
It's all about teaching those skills to meet grief.
Right.
Let's look at this another way. This is an example of a grief history, which is from the grief recovery method. So I'll let Dan describe it.
The grief recovery method was instituted over 40 years ago, and it was put together by an engineer who was facing his own grief. And as an engineer, I could relate to the aspect of using graphs and charts to understand how grief affected my life's journey. And I'd like to go through this brief sample to prepare you to prepare your own grief history. We begin with a simple timeline because let's look at our big picture. On the left-hand side, you start with the date that you were born. On the right-hand side is today's date. And in between, we fill in some of the things that have occurred that have generated that anxiety and grief and sorrow that we all want to deal with. For me, Leah's death was the most significant loss that I've occurred. And so it appears on my grief history chart with the longest vertical line. I've also included some other occasions of grief, not all of them, because I could fill the entire line, but I've added my mom's death and my dad's death with the various lengths. My dad's death happened years ago after we were first married, and my mom's death was more recent. And so I've attributed the length of the line in accordance to the feelings that it invoked for me. I've also included a few of the smaller griefs that I wanted to share, and I've put a pet's grief. We lost a cat recently that was a part of our life for a good number of years. And the Little League example is something that I was involved in as a 7-year-old in a big loss of a championship game. And I didn't realize how I carried that grief with me, even though that it was something that people discounted. My coaches and my parents said, "Oh, just because you struck out doesn't mean it's the end of the world." But to me, I carried that for a long time until I had the wherewithal and understanding to accept and acknowledge that loss as part of the journey that has occurred for me.
And I think that's a really great example of how other people can diminish our grief, whether they're our parents, teachers, or society can diminish our grief. And then we think there's something wrong with us rather than allowing ourselves to meet the feelings when it happens. And then we don't carry that. It doesn't affect our lives, because another part of this is, what is the cost of not meeting our grief? You may also wonder if this is the end of it. And no, this is the start of it. In Dan's work with the grief recovery method, then he would take each one of these occurrences of grief and go through a process to help you meet those feelings and resolve what's going on.
And recover from them.
Yeah.
Grief recovery.
Grief recovery. Here's another way to look at it. This graphic is one that I put together because of an experience that we had when we moved into our house in Raleigh many, many years ago. The house had piles and piles of leaves on the ground, and we found out that the leaves hadn't been raked for over 7 years. So there were a lot of leaves there, and when we got down to the ground, there was nothing growing. And so the leaves represent the layers of protection that we put over our hearts when we feel the feelings of grief, the anger, the confusion, the regret, the loneliness, the pain, the helplessness, the sadness, and many, many, many more. And you can see that if those feelings continue to mound up and continue to protect our hearts, because that's what we're doing. We're protecting our heart from feeling those feelings. There can be no new growth. And in the analogy, the love that is allowed to come into our hearts once we begin to meet these feelings is the same thing that happens when light and water reaches the ground. There's new growth, and we can begin to have a sense of purpose. Now, if you look at it from this perspective, the graphic on the left is representative of where we are when we have all of those layers of protection around our hearts. We are sitting in the isolation or sitting in the compartment, keeping our heart protected, not having to feel those feelings, but we're disconnected from our life. We're disconnected from our family and our friends and maybe our jobs, our spirituality. We aren't able to play or be creative or feel joyful. And we will sit there. How long will we sit there, Dan?
You'll sit in your discomfort until it becomes imperative for you to act.
And imperative for you to act is you discover one of the costs of not meeting them, like health issues or breakups with family members or all kinds of disruption.
Yeah, impact on your job, and what you said about, we're not meant to be pressure cookers. We're not meant to hold all of these feelings inside until it has a impact on our health, whether it is our heart or our mental condition. The discomfort is not something that serves us. And it's learning how to address those feelings so that, like the figure on the right, we can open ourselves up to the creativity and joy and relationships that are available to us once we begin working with and addressing our grief issues.
Yes, you can see the person on the right has much more access to everyone and everything in their lives. And that's what we want for everyone.
That's right. The cost of getting unstuck and opening yourself up to that creativity and meaning and purpose can't go disregarded.
Yeah. Now, if you are in our live workshop, this is a handout that you received. If you're seeing us on Zoom, we sent it to you in the chat. If you're seeing this on a replay, you can take these questions and answer them for yourselves. The first part lists some of the grief that we experience throughout our lifetime. Then there's a few questions for you to ask yourself. And these questions are good to ask at a variety of times because you may get different answers at different times. And then at the bottom is a grief history for you to fill out, taking some time to think about your grief history. What happened throughout your life? What were some of the losses you've experienced? And then you can add lines like Dan showed you in his. And so before we take questions, we want to show you what's possible.
Exactly. And what you can step into when you open yourself to this. So remove the...
Oh, stop sharing. Stop sharing, we'll get to it. So
remove the obstructions that are in your way. Think about addressing the grief that is in your life and look forward to what is possible when you address the journey that you're on.
And that video was our granddaughter, she wasn't quite 3 at that point. She's 3 years old now. And to end our presentation, I just wanted to share with you the story of meeting her. And when I met her, my heart didn't have all those layers of protection on it. And I was able to meet her with a wide open heart, which allowed us the capacity to be able to move to be closer to her so that we can experience that joy every day. So thank you so much for being a part of our presentation. And if anyone has any questions, we would love to take them now.
And thank you, David and Julie, for
Yes, thank
this
you.
opportunity to share some of our thoughts on how grief affects us and how we can move forward in our grief journey.
Yeah.
Dan and Nancy, thank you so much. This was really beneficial, and I think hopefully will help some of our clients. I know David has witnessed this in your practice as people have come into you later in life without doing proper estate planning, right?
Yeah, so, obviously people have grief when they come in, they're grieving when someone has passed away, but there's also the situation where if I'll get a referral and they'll come in and they haven't done proper planning, and that not having proper planning is in place can add extra grief when someone passes away. And Dan and Nancy actually had us on their radio show back well, a lot of months ago, and we talked about that topic, how the intersection of not having proper estate planning can add to more grief.
Yeah, and I thought it was really great that you brought up how broad we need to be thinking about grief and how you can recognize it when it's suddenly, and it does become an obstacle. You're either too angry, your feelings, you can't get past them, you can't move past them, you might have some physical reactions. I know we have had some family circumstances where it just has hit us and we didn't even realize it, and where the emotions just came out. And we just needed to take a minute and say, oh, that was grief. Yeah, exactly. We've got some family members with special needs. And so just parenting issues across the board, the whole family gets impacted. And it's good to recognize that, and because I think it has allowed us to give ourselves some grace and say, okay, that's really what we're dealing with. So we appreciate you, and we're looking forward to your second presentation, which I think is going to be really great. Coming in Saturday, October 21st, we're going to be bringing you back for the second part of this 3-part series, and that one will be I think perfect for timing for the holidays, where you're going to talk about how do we give our loved ones notice on how we may want to change traditions if we need to really recognize our own grief. That's the plan, correct?
That's right.
That's the plan, and we look forward to it. Thank
we
you
look
once
forward
again.
to hosting you again.
Opportunity.
So thank you. And if
Thanks, Dan.
anyone
Thanks,
wants to get a hold of Dan and Nancy, their website is beingwithgrief.com. And I encourage you to contact them if you feel that you are stuck. Really, that's what they are going to be able to help you get past. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.